Step Centre and the Manifesto project in particular, this is a Manifesto project seminar, which is one of the Step Centre's projects, is trying to draw together areas of work on technology and society that have tended to remain quite disparate. Development studies, science and technology studies, STS, some of the economic types of approaches that we've been doing in SPRU. But actually, there is no better example of how that is not a new thing than Arie, because you can't move very far in that domain before you come across things that Arie has already done, often a long time before, thinking through such seminal ideas as niche management, constructive technology assessment, and you've been doing work also in Africa, especially on innovation systems, introducing development studies issues. So Arie really has pioneered a lot of the things that we're trying to bring together, especially the interdisciplinary approaches in the Manifesto. So it's a real pleasure, Arie, to welcome you here, and we look forward to what you have to say.
I can only disappoint after such an introduction, but anyhow, many thanks. This is the topic, and as you can see, I'm putting emphasis here on putting knowledge back in, as I say, and you'll be exposed to that in my presentation. It is part of a larger analysis of dynamics of development of national research and innovation systems, including knowledge, and so that will be more or less the other part of my presentation, and I'll try to come up with some further thoughts or conclusions, including even a comment on the Manifesto project. About my background, there is a brief biography, I think, in the things that were circulated. For this particular presentation, I think it's important to mention that I've been active together with Philippe Laredo from Paris in the PRIME network, which is a European Union funded network of excellence on policy research in science, universities, innovation. And part of that overall network was a small project on this notion of CRIS, Knowledge Research and Innovation System. And we actually could get together people who had been working on this already in Europe, in other places, and we had a focus on Africa for a number of reasons. And we also got a number of people from Africa, partly through me, because I'm also a visiting professor at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, and partly through Philippe Laredo, and anyhow by just being able to look around and identify people. So what I'm going to say is my responsibility, but it actually draws on a number of these activities in these earlier projects. So sometimes actually the papers that I present are co-authored by Philippe Laredo, even without him knowing the details. That's how it goes. So the approach, as I said, combines on the one hand the national research and innovation system stuff, on the other hand an interest in knowledge, what it is about, how it is sort of, well, coming into research and innovation systems again. And I'll start with the first part, which is about the research systems. And the key point is lots of the innovation people, they do sort of mapping of what is there and diagnosing what is lacking. And then they come up with suggestions how to do better. I'm very much interested in an overall path of development, because these suggestions, what is lacking or what should be included in the innovation system to make it function better, often forget the sort of institutional constraints on change and the path dependency in a sense. And so you have to actually go back and look at the longer term developments in order to see what is actually possible. Anything might be possible. You could sort of shout, yes, we can. But still, some things are easier to do than other things. And so this longer term analysis in terms of path and path dependencies is important. And Nelson's book has interesting case studies which actually, and he recognized, actually show the path dependency. And a number of people, including Keith Babbitt, have been talking about that. That's an important dimension which is too easily forgotten. So that's one point to make. And then the next step is that you immediately realize that different paths are possible. And that's something which is somewhat eclipsed by the dominance of what I call, but other people call as well, the modern research system. The triad countries is US, Europe, Japan. There is internal variety, and we could talk about that if you want to, but definitely there is a dominance, and that dominance is not just something that derives from it being politically dominant, or that people in other countries just look at the national systems in the US or Europe or Japan and want to imitate it. That's another way that dominance will emerge. But also because a number of institutions have been actually articulated the features of the modern research system, and in particular since the 1960s, OECD and UNESCO have been doing that. So the national reviews done by OECD, in another way by UNESCO, they have actually almost reified the modern research system. They have said, okay, this is how it should be organized. And on the one hand, that is important to do that kind of thing. And I actually show you in later on in one of my slides a sort of dynamic version of that sort of specification of what a modern research system is about. So I'm not against it, but I am against the reification of it, so that it becomes the only thing and the sort of obvious standard for evaluations and so on, and advice. So, and then the next step, which is particularly important for the prime network, but we could also think about it, is that actually this dominance is reflected in how ST policy studies have been taking this up. Although people think about other countries outside the triad, they think of them as sort of deficient, and so they have to be brought up to this standard somehow. And that's not just the policy point, it's also the analysis that reflects that dominance. And so, I think alternative paths should be considered to be worthy of study just as much, but not just for developing countries, because actually that's another point I want to make later, is that also in the triad countries, in Europe, in the United States, in its own sort of more restrained way in Japan, there are openings up of the research system, and it's not quite clear how it will continue. So this notion of alternative paths as a topic of study is important also for looking at European countries, even the UK, who knows. And then finally, if you've gone so far, you could say, well, if you consider alternative paths as possibilities that an analyst can identify, or practitioners can identify, then the next question is, if these alternative paths are desirable or just interesting, how to modulate ongoing development with all the constraints of path dependencies and interests and politics, so in the direction of a more desirable path. And that's something which I will have in mind, and it will be in the sort of the background of my presentation. I'm not going to talk about actual moves and suggestions, although I do have a slide at the end say, well, what sort of things can you imagine that would be important? But that's more like brainstorming than actually specific advice how to modulate paths. But we could talk about that.